And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Let's take a look now at your marine weather on this Friday, July 14th. We'll start with the surface weather maps to kind of give you a layout. By the time we get to Saturday afternoon, low pressure will be taking shape, not just at the surface, but we have a fairly decent mid-level low that's going to be dropping in from the north and west. And as that works its way southeastward, it's going to help this low to become the dominant feature. Although the low is not an especially strong surface low, we will see southeasterly winds ahead of it through the entrance of Cook Inlet, 25-knot winds and winds on the order of 20 to 25 knots. Kodiak Island down along at least through the middle portion of the Alaska Peninsula. And rather widespread rain. It's going to be a soggy weekend for southwest, south central areas of the state. And by the time we get into Sunday, main area of low pressure here is kind of back toward the Alaska range, toward the southwest, south central interior with widespread, some of the heaviest rain surrounding areas around Cook Inlet, up the Susitna Valley and along the Alaska range, especially wherever you have a southeasterly, southerly component running up there into the terrain. And so this pattern should hold through the weekend and be slow to relax here by the time we get into Monday. As a result, looking in the far north, we continue to see the ice across the Arctic Ocean gradually melt and retreat. We do have some areas of ice still along portions of the Arctic coast, Utqiagvik to north of Prudhoe Bay, also within the area between Point Ley and Cape Lisburne, but otherwise a fair amount of open water through the lower Chukchi Sea and certainly down through the Bering Strait. Winds on Saturday, and waves for that matter, for the Panhandle, relatively light south to variable winds 5 to 10 knots for inner channels, waves a foot or two from Lynn Canal down through Stevens Passage, Dixon Entrance. As we get out along the Gulf Coast, look at these winds, just variable around 5 knots with waves running a few feet, especially there off of Sitka, Gustavus. Winds try to turn a little more westerly at 10 knots there outside of Yakutat Bay with waves 2 to 3 feet. And then on Sunday for the inner channel, southeast to south winds around 10 knots, waves a foot or two. For the outer coast, south of Gustavus, Sitka down through Craig, south to southwest winds 10 knots. But look for more of an offshore northeasterly wind, 10 knots between Gustavus and Yakutat with waves running a couple few feet. Across the northwestern Gulf and including Cook Inlet, strongest winds will be down here from middle Cook Inlet down through the entrance to just north of Kodiak Island. Look for southeast to south winds around 25 knots with waves 5 to as high as 7 feet. Look for southeast winds at 15 knots across Prince William Sound, southerly winds 15 knots through upper Cook Inlet. And on Sunday, winds will fall off here down here toward the entrance of Cook Inlet, variable winds around 10 knots with the frontal system and trough kind of lying right overhead. On the north side of it, winds will be east to northerly, 10 to 15 knots, waves running 2-3 feet here within Prince William Sound. And once we get well south of Hinchinbrook entrance there, winds will be generally easterly about 15 knots with waves of 3 to 4 feet. Across the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island south winds 20 to 25 knots, turning more westerly as you get out the length of the Alaska Peninsula. Waves running 2 to 3 feet on the North Pacific side and 4 to 5 feet on the Bering side. For Sunday, southwest winds around 15 knots around Kodiak Island, and look for generally west-northwest winds to 20 knots along the Alaska Peninsula with waves running a few feet on the North Pacific side and 3 to 4 feet on the Bering side. And across the Aleutians on Saturday, winds will be out of the west-northwest across the eastern Aleutians 15 to 20 knots, turning back toward the southwest around 15 to 20 knots, especially west of Atka. Waves on the North Pacific side 5 to 6 feet and generally 3-4 feet on the Bering side. And for Sunday, winds across the eastern Aleutians will generally be northwesterly 15 to 20 knots. Variable winds in the vicinity of the central Aleutians to 10 knots, turning back around to the south-southwest, 15 to near 20 knots across the western Aleutians. And for Saturday, along areas of the southwest coast, We have low pressure in this region, so we'll find ahead of it, Bristol Bay winds will be southeast veering south and then southwesterly around 15 knots. On the backside, winds will be more the north-northwest, especially off of the Yukon Delta to St. Matthew, 10 to 15 knots, and westerly winds into Norton Sound around 10 knots with waves of 2 feet. On Sunday, as the low kind of gets better situated here north of Lake Iliamna and just kind of on the west side of the Alaska Range within this region. North winds coming down along Norton Sound 15 knots, 20 knots as you get along the lower Yukon Delta, and then look for northwest winds 20 knots. A little higher even there through Etolan Strait, and both Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bays, northwest winds to 20 knots with waves running a few feet there. Along the Arctic coast, winds will be west-northwest 10 to 15 knots. Look for northerly winds through the lower Chukchi Sea 20 to 25 knots with waves of 4 to 6 feet. And on Sunday, winds will be out of the northeast to east 10 knots from Kaktovik to just east of Utqiagvik. And then as we go down through the lower Chukchi Sea, winds turn back toward the north again at 10 to 15 knots, increasing to 20 knots through the Bering Strait, and northwest to west winds around 20 knots on the north side of St. Lawrence Island in the vicinity of Gambell.